Yeah, and it's a, I understand it because I've been doing it for 20 years and still trying to, but you know, I can say whatever I want, but you still have to experience it and go through it and kind of figure it out for yourself. Depends on the type of learning, but you know, I had one lady in a Word Level 1 class that at lunch ran out crying because it was so overwhelming for her. So before lunch, I'm like, so how's it going? How's the pace? Excuse me. And I'm like, oh, oops. But for her, it was, and I went and talked to her, and it wasn't personal. She's got depression and some anxiety stuff. And I just said, you're not here to get more. This should not stress you out more. If it is, then we need to figure out a way because this should not be a stressful situation for Word Level 1 or those things. And so she ended up dropping, but for her it was just, so it varies on individual. And she was older, hadn't worked on computers in years, and her husband left, you know, just a lot of different things that were kind of, but that's the only time I've had a student cry. That I felt somewhat responsible for.
I will try. I will try.
Going for number 2. All right. I want to get through 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, 4.4, 4.5. Just kidding. 4.1, 4.2, 4.3. So again, I will point out items more specific to test questions. We are, again, getting into some things that we have talked about before. We talk about DNS, they talk about DHCP, they talk about denial of service. And so those kind of things I am not necessarily going to repeat. My suggestion would be if it's something that we are hearing again, that is because it is important. Right? DNS is one of the things that is critical on a network. Active Directory, your DHCP. So when they talk about DNS and security, you know, it's something that comes up frequently, and that's not because it's horrible and unuseful. It's because it is very important, and we need to deal with it. So some of the things, bookmark if you want. I've got some tabs up here if you need any. And then we'll just kind of go from there. And I've got a couple videos that will help kind of bring some of it together too. So, is that a sneeze? Bless you. You're blessed.
No, it was an ouch.
Oh.
It hurts.
Well, you're still blessed.
Oh, thank you.
You blow your brains out.
For the next one.
I heard my dad had nothing to do with sneezing, y'all. I'm allowed to sneeze. He's gonna listen to me. Oh, it's littler than that.
Sure.
So when my mom laughs, my brother jokes around, we put her on mute. Because she doesn't make a sound, but you can just tell she's just tearing up. So as soon as she starts laughing, we're hitting the remote. Mute. And then when she sneezes, it's just as quiet. I can't sneeze quietly, it hurts too much. I gotta let it out. All right, secure protocols and services. Tell me what a protocol is. Don't care if it's secure or not. Protocol, tons of them the last 2 weeks. Just the last 5 weeks. Protocol, set of rules. Do we have to abide by it? If we want to talk, if we want to perform the task, if I want to work with DHCP, Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, we don't need to know the individual numbers. So what was an RFC? You can't sleep at night, go read some RFCs, and I guarantee you'll be out soon. It's the deep down scientific, just technical know-how of the protocol. We have been through them off and on a little bit. Some are a few pages, some of them are hundreds of pages. And we're talking about, and there's thousands of RFCs. Basically, if there's an RFC, it means it is a common open standard protocol. Cisco had this one, right? eGrip routing protocol, enhanced interior gateway routing protocol. The other ones that we had before that, we had RIP, OSPF. Okay, we'll see a little bit on those. RIP, well actually let's do this. We're going to stick with RIP version 2. All three of these are routing protocols. RIP, what do we know about RIP?
Basically, it goes out and finds its partners around its kind of.
It is. We have what we call, it is. Routing protocols will talk to each other about their neighbor, right? Jess is going to talk to Killian, not Pam directly. She talks to Killian, Killian then talks to Pam. So RIP, there's something, and RIP is what we call a distance vector. Okay? So this is something that we'll see some of. And it's based on hops. RIP is limited to 15 hops. So if I have a large network, more than 16 hops to go around, RIP won't work. RIP version 1 did not work with subnetting. So if we borrowed bits and did any of that, didn't work. So they came out with RIP version 2 because now it works with different subnet masks or the CIDR notation or the VSLAN, variable length subnet mask. So that was RIP. Then they came out with OSPF, open shortest path first. And this is not necessarily distance vector. This is what we call link state. And this is for extremely large networks. So Jess could have a connection to Killian as far as a router goes, and it's a 10 meg connection. Yet she talks to everybody else through a 100 meg connection. OSPF will go this route because it is faster, even though that is shorter hops. So that's the OSPF, open shortest path first. Each physical connection has a cost. Gigabit, 10 meg. So it's not based on hop. eGrip is Cisco saying, oh, I like some of this, I like some of this. We're the biggest routers in the world. We're going to go ahead and make our own rule. And eventually it became well enough embraced that it became a standard. So when we deal with routing protocols, just an example of how we have products or vendor products that now become protocols at some point. All right, so we'll look at name resolution, secure networks, time synchronization. There's a little video I'm going to show on that. And then dealing with our secure web email file, and a little bit on our VoIP. Here's if I've got a LAMP at home, what am I doing or running? That's absolutely true. If I'm running, let me add to this. If I'm running a LAMP server, what am I doing? This is one of the more commonly configured server combinations out there in the world. Linux, Apache, is that a Y?
No, it's
Okay. MySQL, and then some will say this is Perl, and others will say it is PHP. So, but it's basically our open source. So if you wanted to set up your own web server at home, this is kind of your free, best all-in-one solution. Of course, there are different versions and whatnot, but it's called our LAMP server. We have our Linux operating system. Apache is our Linux web server. MySQL is the open source database, right? We have Excel, which is X and Y. We have Access, which is X, Y, and Z. And then we get, which is more small business, personal. And then we get into SQL Server, Oracle, Sybase, MySQL. Those are all what we call enterprise. So this is my own database, and then Perl or PHP is the scripting language or the programming language I use to kind of build it all together. I've seen this on NetPlus. You might see some parts of it on Security Plus, not necessarily as LAN, but Linux, we talked about this towards the end of this chapter, right? Apache. We talk about SQL later on as well, as far as one of the hacks that people do is what we call a SQL injection, where they're adding code through a particular means or way of getting into and hacking in or getting information. And then, of course, our programming language, we have to always be careful when we're talking scripting or code, right? I can create logon scripts that do just about anything I want to on the network. Very dangerous. We have to be careful. So, and then our web server. All right, so DHCP, blast through that, right? Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, IP addresses. What are some of the suggestions when we are configuring DHCP? It's not a very expensive service. In other words, it doesn't take up a lot of space. And once we set it up, it kind of runs itself, but we do have security issues. From what means, or how do I worry about DHCP and security?
It's broadcast based, so you can intercept whatever. Like
Correct.
You can get in, you can set up a rogue DHCP server and start making people go all over the place.
Right, we talked about DHCP is a broadcast. How do I stop broadcast? The router. I put a router in to stop. So if I have two networks and I'm assigning addresses automatically and there's a router, I have a problem. I have to have a DHCP server on each network to handle it. We also saw that Cisco can handle it through its router interface. If I don't want to put two servers out there, what is the one item that I have on this network that can talk to this server? And you will see this on the test. It's called a DHCP relay agent. I've got the clients over here, and instead of talking to a local DHCP server, they talk to Jeremy, who is the relay, and then he is allowed to go through the router on our behalf. So that one I've seen NetPlus, Security Plus, and even in the Microsoft stuff. So network address, it's automatic. We try to prevent rogue DHCP servers. Does that mean I physically bring in a box, plug it in through a network? No. I can have my own little wireless, whatever it is, and all I do is connect. HP had problems with this, where they would have managers, project managers who would come in and they'd bring in their own wireless so that they could work in their own little group. And they had all these rogue access points. And it was great for the people working together. But guess what? If I'm a couple cubicles over and I grab a wireless signal, all of a sudden I can't get to network resources because I have their access point. So that was one of the things they prevented. Also, when we deal with DHCP, if we remember the database, right? DHCP has a computer name and it has an associated IP address in its table. Now, it's not necessarily resolving a name to an IP address, but when DHCP starts up, it's going to say, here's computer so-and-so, and here's the IP address, and I'm leasing it to it for 8 days. Now, if I put on a rogue device or if I connect on my own and get a DHCP address, I suddenly have the means to get a lot of information. I know your IP address. I know your subnet mask. I even know your primary and alternate DNS servers, gateway, all these different things, and now I can start to go out and do other things. So we need to be careful on those DHCP servers, rogue clients, and then our secure administration. And this is, again, this is our Windows Microsoft console. So we're getting into our scopes. We have two types. I have a forward and I have a reverse. I must create a forward. I do not have to create a reverse. In fact, for security purposes, a lot of organizations will not use a reverse lookup zone because it's just something else they have to deal with. Some like doing it, or they might have something on their public side of their firewall, because if they see IP addresses, they can do a reverse lookup and find out, oh, who's this IP address? And sometimes it will resolve it to a name.
Mail a lot of times does that.
Yep.
So that they enable through mail.
Yep. And when we saw VPNs in the Active Directory accounts, sometimes when they call in, I have to call back to that same number to make sure that it's them from that physical phone at home. All right, so DHCP, one of the things you need to be careful of as far as IP addresses, a lot of information. DHCP is on a server or on a router interface, so this is also a physical box that needs to be secured in some manner. DNS, right? We talked about the host file, Windows, System32, drivers, etc. Host file. And that was a static file that resolves the name to an IP address. So somebody could go in and put in a static entry. Now, what's the big thing that we have to worry about with DNS? And we've talked about this several times. DNS is critical. It's, in fact, for Microsoft, for Active Directory, it is a requirement. I cannot run a Windows domain without DNS. And I have two areas that I worry about: the public DNS realm and my private internal DNS realm. And we have to handle them similarly, but in different means. One, I'm dealing with the public internet, web servers, email servers, public namespace. The other is handling it privately. So when we deal with cache poisoning, somebody's going in and putting a different value in that file. So instead of saying computer 1 equals 1, they're going to say computer 10 actually equals 1. So now we're going to the wrong computer, and we may not know or even think that we're going through something. Man in the middle, we've talked about that quite a bit, where somebody's actually intercepting traffic. And then we have our DNS server cache. When we cache files, those types of files can be viewed and looked at and changed. So we may not want to have those files cached very long. And they're always cached on the local machine. So DNS spoofing, you'll see that on the test. So one of the alternatives we have for DNS is our secure DNS. And it's basically an add-on. It's an extension for DNS, which encrypts and protects that traffic for us. When we deal with our DNS, let's see, DNS security. Thought I had a note, I don't. Anyway, it has to do with certificates. We've talked a lot about certificates. There's 13 or 14 types of certificates.
Root hints.
What's that?
Root hints.
Root hints. There's 13 public root servers. When we get into DNS, hold on. In Windows Server, we have what we call Active Directory integrated zones. Okay. Now, we talked about physical security. I create subnets for a couple purposes. I create domains, right? Idaho.gov, Boise.idaho.gov. Do you remember the three main reasons that we kind of use to create these different boundaries? I'll tell you one, it's replication, right? Keep replication within Boise. Keep replication within our physical building. So replication is one type of boundary we have to deal with. And for DNS, we create different domain zones to deal with that replication. What was another one? Replication boundaries, security boundaries, right? If I have a domain, that is my security boundary. And the last one was our delegation. I'm going to delegate somebody to be responsible for it. Now, there's other reasons, but from my experience, they all kind of fall into one of those three things. Why do you have a 10-story building and each floor is its own separate network? Keep the traffic on the floor. It can still route if it needs to. Create that security boundary. I've got tier 1, 2, 3 support. Each of those individuals is responsible for one of those particular pieces. If it's all named the same, somebody gets into one, they technically have access to all of it, as opposed to 10. Trade-off, more administration, but typically we're more secure. So we have to find that balance. In your book, my book is page 318. It's the page after this DNSSEC slide. They talk type squatting, domain hijacking. We don't see this as often nowadays, but when we're talking kiting, tasting, hijacking, cyber squatting, all of these, what are we typically having to deal with? What type of, yes, attacks, but kind of in a little bit different perspective or angle. My name is Kyle Johnson. I want to purchase KyleJohnson.com. Why does Jess have it? Why did she register it? Why does she own it? She doesn't have any relation or any need for Kyle. She just knows that she can make money off it by holding on to that domain, right? And that's what we get into the kiting, tasting, hijacking. I have not, well, I guess I have. Typically, when we register a DNS name, we can hold on to it temporarily for 5 days. So a lot of these companies that do this, they'll register a name, see what kind of traffic it generates, and if there's a lot, then they'll purchase it. If not, then they'll release it back. We actually had a problem with this 15 years ago, 12 years ago, somewhere in there. And the name we wanted was called Biota, B-I-O-T-A. And it was a company out of Australia. So their namespace was biota.au.com. We wanted to purchase the local one. And it was part of a merger, so there was a different, it was kind of a combined name. We found out that somebody owned it, had no relation to it. You go to the page and it said, hey, to purchase this domain, go here. We actually got to the point where we offered them $10,000 for the name because that's what they asked. And as soon as we said 10, they said we want 20. The CEO, which was my dad and some of the other people, decided that it was worth the $20,000 to own that name. And then they said, no, we want 30. And then we said, fine, we're done. Yes. Yeah. So I've had to deal with that from a very frustrating perspective. You could then, but as long as you have something, that was a Nissan case. There's also a Microsoft, but it's spelled with a different M-I-C-R-O-S-Y-F-T or whatever, I can't remember. But I think that particular one, if I remember the individual's name, even though he's a small individual, it was his name.
And he owned it before Nissan was even brand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
And
then
they
they-
lost a lot of money because Nissan just kept suing.
Finally have to.
No, he didn't relinquish it. He's
He
like,
didn't?
no.
Good. I couldn't remember.
He just keeps getting sued.
They were trying to sue me.
Oh no, they sued him a bunch of times, but like he lost so much money out of it because it was just like his local computer business, and his last name was Nissan. Nissan just screwed it.
The Nissan conglomerate wanted to own it and take over.
Yeah,
I
they
don't think
changed that
that's
name.
even possible before they.
Oh yeah, they sued. Yeah.
Well, that's where when you decide to come up with your company name, maybe you change it.
He
You
just
don't
kept-
go that
he
route.
just kept losing. I mean, they kept losing. They just kept losing.
They just took
Or
time.
they had Nissan car.
Right. That was the main reason why they ruled against Nissan.
And I understand both aspects, and I kind of say, Nissan, sorry, I think you're kind of out of luck.
That's the source.
But there are some cases where they will, like for us, we could go to that individual and we could try to file something because there is no branding ownership of any kind to that name. All they're doing is holding it for profit and hijacking it, as opposed to Nissan where the name did match, but it was just a different industry. So those are some of the things that when we deal with DNS on the public side, and when you purchase a DNS name, you guys deal with this at City of Nampa? Or who's in charge of your public DNS stuff? There you go. How often do you have to deal with, who, do you host your own?
Yes.
Okay. Is it a constant battle or does it kind of run itself?
Pretty good. It's, yeah, I'm sure it'll be good. It's got a pretty long thing.
That's good. I always try this, but I know the results.
Why would you want? I mean, why would you want KyleJohnson.com? I mean, really?
It was my own business.
Man, I would.
Or I was, I know some people will do it for like family history, genealogy, so they'll have their name registered to it. I wouldn't have my personal name, but it's just one I always look because I know it's, could you?
Yeah, I didn't want to. I feel like.
Plus, if it's $3, why not?
Go to the Nissan.com.
So right now, I could get KyleJohnson.io, store, club, space, tech, biz, shop, online, love, pro, global design, cloud, world, life, services, rocks.
You could buy Kyle J.
Kyle J is considered premium for $900. And then once you, and we did quite a bit with GoDaddy years ago because they were kind of our central hosting.
Nissan.com.
Nissan Motors lawsuit against us.
Yeah, well, they had to shut down the company because they had to go to court so many times. Now they just have like that screw you Nissan page.
Yeah, it's going to cost them, what, $12 a year to hold on to it? And you know you have like a whole group of team members at Nissan looking out to see if they forget one time.
Yeah. Wonder how much they pay.
Oh, they offered
So they went to .net.
They offered.
I mean, if they're dropping that kind of cash.
Oh no, yeah, they offered them something.
So go to Nissan.net.
I wonder why he still wouldn't do it. At some point, it was probably just a matter of,
Oh, they sued him for that one too. They sued him on that one too.
Yeah, they offered this guy some money. I've read about it. They offered it. Well, because it was at the time. This was 1994 when the first time they sued him, and yeah, they offered him like a couple $100,000. And he's like, no, I like it. This is mine.
I just like it. I'd rather not retire.
Hey, this is my name. You know,
Yeah, there it is.
Nissan.
NissanUSA.com.
Man, take the money.
heck yeah.
And he was like, no, this is my name, and I want the.
I put a yearly finder's fee on it.
I'll take
5% of, I'll take 1% of everything you sell using that my domain name.
1%. Yeah.
I'll give it to you for $10 million.
So now they've gone, but I mean, we kind of joke about it and we see it, but this kind of stuff does happen. We don't see it as much as we used to. Why would we see more of it 15, 20 years ago? Because the internet was so new and a lot of people didn't even have connections. Whereas now, since we're so socially and digitally connected, now everybody's trying to get everything. That's why when we go over here, we see all these additional namespaces, right? It's because there's no more KyleJohnsons.com, but they want to sell more. So all they do is create these names and then go to those 13 root DNS servers, add that new namespace, and then they can start purchasing and registering it from there. And also now we can deal based on industry. So if I were to look at this, right off the bat, I would never do this, maybe. I've seen Biz, Shop Online, Love, Pro, nope. Global, Design, Cloud, World, Life, Services, News, maybe, Media. So a lot of those I would never even think of looking at a company's name.
Wow.
I know the XXX was big for a while, trying to, you know, keep the industry. And I understand industries following their own namespace, but it would be such a shift getting everybody to do it. So anyway, something we have to worry about. You'll see some of that on the test as far as some of those vulnerabilities. Footprinting. You guys heard of footprinting? That's basically where somebody gets your zone file through a DNS transfer, because DNS servers talk to each other. So if I put up a rogue DNS server and your valid DNS server is not secure, it will now start replicating with my rogue server, and now I can start to replicate all of your company's DNS records. Typically, you need, bless you, physical access of some kind. Bless you. All right, so DNS, SNMP, Network Management Protocol, simple network, and this is something that a lot of third-party tools use. It's basically what we use to keep track of different services, hardware on the network. And we set these agents or traps to look for things to happen. And this is the management protocol that is being used by default. We have 3 versions. Version 4 is in development. Version 1 and 2, we prefer not to use. Version 3 now gives us the encryption for our SNMP, as long as your hardware supports it. And we typically just log into a web page and we set up our different options, our agents. So different for us, for SNMP, right? If I have my server, we'll say this is our email server, I'm going to have an agent installed on there, and that agent is what talks to my SNMP using SNMP. Right, so it's what talks. So now I get data on that particular agent, and then I have agents on all the different pieces or components, and they're updating my server. Probably see SNMP. Just know version 3 gives you the encryption. I don't think you will need to know the ports, but they basically are dealing with 161 and 162. All right, let's
Sorry. Spammers. Somebody from there, but trying to think myself. I think. Spoofing.
one of the other ones you'll probably see on the test. I'm going to show you it, not the whole video. I'm going to show you some of it, talking about NTP, right? Because we saw earlier how critical the network time is. And we also learned that by default, the first domain controller on my network is my time server. You don't need to know that it's the PDC emulator, although that's a bonus point. But you won't need to know that on this. If you take the Microsoft test, you will need to know that, but not for sec plus or net plus. But if our time isn't synchronized, replication doesn't work. Our authentication has problems. Our encryption has problems. Other services have problems if the times are off. Clustering, right? Clustering has those heartbeats that go out. And depending on how it's configured, those heartbeats are going every second and sometimes even at the millisecond. So if the time is off between those elements, then our clusters fail. So I'm showing this because we've seen the network time in a couple different sections, but I want to go to the second bullet. So we'll.
In our realm of existence, time is a pretty big deal. And as it relates to Cisco devices, the time can just keep a whole lot of stuff straight. Stuff that we can relate to right now at this level of our learning is things like log files and certificates. We just a couple nuggets ago were just talking about syslog. And imagine you've got a few devices on your network. You got your router connected to the internet, and that goes into a switch, and that switch connects to a couple wireless access points, maybe a second switch down here. And there's somebody trying to hack your network, and they got in, and you're trying to figure out where are they and what's going on, what's happening. And syslog will oftentimes be a key to that. And what happens with your syslog messages if you leave the time by default? This is the router I booted up about half an hour ago. I'll do a show clock on it. And you can see it's been running about half an hour. It's midnight on March 1st, 2002. Even if you are using syslog and reporting everything to a centralized server, you're going to have timestamps that throw these messages completely out of order, and it's going to be completely jumbled when you try and look at it. Or what about certificates? Certificates are responsible for much of the encryption for things like SSH or VPN connections on our device. And hackers know that if they change the time of your device or can somehow get in there and mess up the time, all those certificates will expire and the Cisco router will stop using them. Thus, all of these services begin to fail on your device. And there's so much more we could talk about with time. The key to remember is that we want our time in sync. We can't leave these things by default. And it may make us feel better to come in here and say, well, let's do a clock set command. And this is a command you will definitely want to know. We'll say, well, right now it is 9:51 a.m. on, it's October 5th, 2016. And I hit the enter key. And now I feel a little bit better because when I
So this is him. He's using a tool that a lot of us use called PuTTY, where he's basically now has this installed on his laptop or device, and then he's created some sort of a session to his router. And so when we talk about command line, this is exactly what we're doing. We're not right-clicking on folders. We're not, we're just typing in, and we have to know the different instructions. So if you didn't know what these instructions were, you would have to look them up. And if we use things more, obviously we become more familiar.
I do a show clock, it goes, oh, I've got the right time, it's going to maintain, but there's going to be clock drift. This is not a super accurate clock device. So over time, the seconds will turn to minutes, and the minutes might turn to hours, and we end up way out of sync there. Or if we reboot the device, it's probably going to lose the time, because in my device specifically, there's no battery that keeps this thing up and running and keeps the time accurate, right? So I go through all of that introduction to say there's a specific protocol. It's known as NTP, Network Time Protocol, that will keep your devices in sync. So first thing to understand is this idea of a stratum. So somewhere in the center of the universe is this atom, that this atom tells us exactly what time it is. And this is where you can go on Wikipedia and read all about this kind of stuff. This is essentially the stratum 0. This is the most accurate time that we could possibly have in our universe of existence today. And then something that gets the time from that amazing universal device is known as a stratum 1 device. And then something that gets the time from that guy is a stratum 2 device. So the further away you go into the stratum numbers, technically more inaccurate the time will be, right? Because it's like, the kindergarten kids passing the message along, the further it goes, the more jumbled it is. But in reality, and when we're talking milliseconds of difference on here. So it's okay to use a Stratum 3, Stratum 4 device, because when we're working with computers, they're far more accurate than a bunch of kindergarten kids standing in line. That being said, there are tons of Stratum 1 and Stratum 2 servers publicly available that we can configure our Cisco devices to go out to. Now, some security practices. When you are getting into a very secure environment, people will say, you shouldn't have all your devices on your network going out to these internet time sources, because once you get outside of the network, evil person X out here could compromise the message and send in a spoofed packet or something to that effect that can make these guys have the inaccurate time. And if you have a lot of things relying on that time function being accurate, your network will fail. And that is a good practice. The best thing to do is have one or two different devices, we'll say these two routers, going out to the internet time source out here, and then they provide the time to all of the devices inside. And that could be network devices, that could be servers. There's many different ways they can do that. Matter of fact, 3, one of which we'll talk about here. One, you can set up your devices to pull an NTP server. So every X amount of time, your device, and we could just say even a server, can go out there and say, NTP time source, let's point to this guy, the penguin. NTP time source, what is the time? It sends it back, adjusts the message for the amount of transit time it took between the source and destination device, and boom, you update your clock to be accurate. You can also have your devices listen to NTP multicast. So you could set up a router to start sending multicast messages through your entire network, right? And everybody that is tuned into that multicast address listens to that. So it can kind of continually keep those devices in sync. Or if you're a little bit crazy or a small network environment, you can just have the device continually send NTP broadcasts, and everybody can just simply listen to the broadcast message and set their time from there. So let's get our time going on our Cisco router. I'm going to log into the device. The first thing I want to do is actually undo the time manual set that I did just a moment ago. So I'll do a show clock. I'm currently October 5th. So let's do a clock set. Go back to midnight on March 2nd, 2002. And I'll do a show clock just because I want us to see NTP kick in and make a drastic change on our device. Now notice I'm still in the Universal Time Coordinated. That's also known as Greenwich Mean Time. At the center of the world, there's this 0 time, if you will, or 0 offset. And as you travel around the world, you either go negative hours or positive hours in, that's where our time zones come from, right?
Okay. We don't need to go into more, but wanted to at least see how we may need to configure it, deal with this administratively on the network. This is also something that can be difficult to troubleshoot. You have synchronization problems, you have replication problems. You're trying to synchronize and replicate between Pocatello and Boise, so you're going through a WAN link. Why isn't it working? Time is now, as we're going through the OSI model, we're getting into the upper layers, dealing with more software and services, and that typically will create some problems that can be very difficult to troubleshoot. All right. Questions on HTTP? You will see this. HTTP is a higher level OSI, 6, 7. We use HTTP in our web browser. Chrome is the #1 now. I think Firefox is 2, and I'm not even sure where Internet Explorer Edge is nowadays. 15 years ago, it kind of used to be the other way around. Internet Explorer had roughly 8%, 75, 80%. See, best browsers: Firefox, Chrome, Opera, Edge, Explorer, Vivaldi, Tor, dealing more with the deep web, dark web. Right, and we get new browsers that support new parts of HTTP. As HTTP develops into its protocol, right? We have browsers that allow us to do more dynamic things, and therefore we need to be secure, be more concerned with securing it. 2018, Internet Explorer sags below 10%. Top browsers of August. Is our internet slow? The other thing, 10 years ago, a lot of applications were built and needed Internet Explorer to function correctly. Nowadays, that's not the case either. So Chrome's user share is up above 65%. Barring any change, Chrome will account for 70% of the browsers in June of next year. Edge and IE shared slipped 0.2, falling to 15%. Right, and it used to be up to 74%. Firefox at 10%. See, I would thought that would have been higher.
Not very secure.
I don't use it very much. Chrome is what Safari, Apple, approximately 0.2 last month, up to just under 4%. As of August, 39% of all Mac owners ran Safari, have largely abandoned it and gone to Chrome. Okay, so do you use Safari or Chrome?
I actually use Vivaldi.
Oh, you do? How do you like it?
I love it.
Do you really?
I started off with it at work on my Windows computer, and then I downloaded it to both my Macs. And it's great.
Really? I've read about it. It's one I've actually never used.
Oh, really? Yeah, it's got some really nice features built into it.
I'll have to look at that.
Which buddy?
Vivaldi,
Oh,
have you used it? I know they've got, like for mobile devices, Dolphin is a browser. They've got Aloha, so they've got other browsers that do different things for us. So, okay, very cool. I'll have to look at Vivaldi. All right, so big thing about HTTP, port 80, it's not secure, which is why we see HTTPS in most websites. If I go back to my web page, right, 10, 15 years ago, more than half the pages I went to did not have an S. They were just HTTP. The only reason they would need to put S there is if you were purchasing or doing online work in any way. Whereas now it has basically become the standard. In fact, very rarely do I see something without HTTPS. And if I do, it almost always has a little message here saying not secure. Okay. So what's the difference between HTTPS here and me going open in incognito, besides it being dark? So what is incognito? Most browsers have this other version.
just a quick cache. And it doesn't use cookies and all that stuff.
Most of the
Doesn't report back to the web server. It's big.
well, there's communications with the server, but none of it is retained locally. There always has to be a request response, but you're right, it's not stored locally. So if we have a public computer, right, at the library or something like that, this would be one of the things that I guess could be done. Most of the time, I hardly ever use it. I guess if I wouldn't want people seeing where I'm going or what I'm doing, kind of a thing. It's not a problem that I have or worry about. At our home, we have the computer there facing everybody, so nobody can has the temptation to do anything inappropriate. But our incognito mode or something like that is HTTPS, but it's just not storing anything locally. So when we close that browser session, there should not be anything left over. And really the one way we can tell is it's dark. We almost always see this little spy hat or goggles or something like that. It's not something that's very conspicuous. And you almost always have to select the option. Incognito is not something like you click a link and it suddenly opens it up. You almost always have to right click and say open incognito. Although if I'm in incognito, right? So Chrome won't save the following: browsing history, cookies, information that you put into forms. Your activities might still be visible to websites you visit, your employer or school, and or your ISP. And wherever you work, they most likely have some sort of a hiring agreement that say, hey, regardless of where you go, we're monitoring. And some of that would be outside of this browser, but on the network. So that's kind of our other little piece there. All right, so HTTP. Web servers, the two big ones to know is Apache, and Microsoft's is called IIS, and it's been around for a couple decades. Internet Information Server or Services, IIS. I believe they're at version 7.0, 7.1. I'd have to double check. When we talk vulnerabilities, a lot of people will say Microsoft's product is less secure. I don't know if that's true. They say that it's hacked more, but if more people use the browser, just the actual percentage of users seems to be fairly constant regardless of what your particular server product is. One of the nice things about LAMP is the Apache server, the Linux server, becomes very configurable. So you can really lock it down or harden that server if you choose to. Right, Mike said that he takes care of his own web stuff. I could go to GoDaddy, the cloud, other things like that. Just know that nowadays we have many options for our public presence and our web, our internet solution. We host our own dedicated server. What's good about that? It's mine. I control everything. What's the bad part? It's mine. I have to secure everything, be concerned with everything, as opposed to going to GoDaddy. As long as I trust GoDaddy, that would be a valid source, knowing that they're doing the things on my behalf, or Microsoft Azure. We also deal with these three things, which you'll see on the test. Not necessarily right at this spot, but we see it. So we're seeing a lot of solutions that fit in with this slide. Software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service. So I could basically create an entire internal organization, virtual internal organization, without owning a piece of hardware, except for maybe, workstations or something like that. My Active Directory, my email, everything, all hosted through a different infrastructure that I choose to. A lot of solutions, always going to be a little bit more money, but now we're saying, hey, I don't have to pay somebody $80,000 as an engineer for my network. I can pay for the service and have Microsoft or somebody else do that. All right, so web servers, HTTP, obviously all related. You will need to know hardening. Just know hardening in general. So when we're hardening, what are some of the key things we're doing? If I harden a server,
Take away unnecessary services. Sorry, I didn't mean to answer.
no, that was it. Keep it lean, right? Why have a web server installed if I'm not doing any hosting? Don't need it. Okay, so that's probably the main thing, is remove anything we don't need. We also need to secure what's on the machine. And then we still have our AAA, right? Authentication, authorization, authentication, and let me rephrase it. Authentication, authorization, and then our accounting or auditing. Once I know who you are, you're authenticated, you're authorized to do things, and I keep track through accounting. So hardening your server, you'll see a question or two on that. Just know what it is, regardless of whether it's a web server, an email server, a domain controller, DNS server. And, oops. Let me blow this up a little.
There's a question about secure file transfer. There's some questions on the
FTPS, SFTP, secure.
Yeah, which is like not normally used, but more Linux based stuff.
Yeah, we don't. So this is Microsoft's web server console, right? We can see.
There's a question about, file once, you give your choice of protocols, and it says pick one that it had secure file transfer for Linux, basically.
How often do we use FTP nowadays?
Still,
Do you?
I don't like to, but
Where did FTP originate from, or what was the purpose of FTP originally? Now we're talking like 30 years ago or so. Universities, government, it was a way that we could transfer files or let somebody from a university log in and download files. So not necessarily just sending messages, but giving file access. 10 plus years ago, you could go to Microsoft's site and they actually had an FTP server. So you just type ftp.microsoft.com, and if they have an FTP server, it gives you access to it. If I were to see a web page that was, see an FTP connection, all it would look like is folder structure. I would see the server I'm connected to. I would see my machine, open up the folders, see the files, right-click, copy, download, drag and drop. That's just using File Explorer. There's also all sorts of third-party tools that you can use. The last time I really used FTP was for websites where you can upload your pages using FTP, and you can create a secure connection. I used Adobe Dreamweaver. You just build the connection as long as you have the right path and username and password. When you set it up, you can say, I want it to be secure, and then you've made the changes to your web page. Hit the refresh, and boom, it uploads or downloads all the pages. So this is, again, this is Microsoft. We should be used to this view by now, our management console. You can see this one's got certificates on it. It's got our LaSUS, so our software update services. Okay, so hardening our web server or other servers. Questions on SSL, secure socket layers. Port 443 is one you might want to kind of enter in your brain somewhere. It's one of the more common ones. So you may see that question on the test.
In practice, the couple one that it's like what needs to happen before you establish this interchange keys.
Yep.
Is the question.
So we're dealing with certificates. And we talked last week about the TLS, the transport layer security. So we're talking layer 4. Two things are done at layer 4, TCP or UDP. So when we're talking certificates here, we're talking layer 4 connection through dealing with encryption and security at that layer 4, that middle layer. The other big thing to know, we're dealing with certificates with our SSL.
Session.
What's that?
Session layer?
Transport.
Transport.
Probably not, well, network layer would be IP, that'd be your routers. So no, it's dealing with transport, right? TCP is our handshake connection, so that's where the transport layer is.
That's layer 3. Right?
That's
What's that?
physical data link network, or physical
Please do
data
not throw sausage pizza in there.
network layer, and then transport. Physical data network transport.
I got it.
And then we have session, presentation, application. Yeah, and again, when you take the test, you can just write the 7 layers and please do not throw sausage pizza away before you start your questions if you choose to. Right, so we talked about 802.1x last week. What was 1x? Physical. Port layer security. And what layer is the physical layer? Layer 1. So when we're dealing with 802.1x, we're dealing with it down at the physical, layer 1. Here, we're dealing with it up kind of in the middle, layer 4, the transport layer. When we deal with our smart cards, secure IDs, those kind of things, we all handle at this point. You will see questions on SSL, TLS, several, Net Plus, probably, Security Plus, absolutely. Now I believe, I believe they're in Wireshark. But here we can go through and see our connection as far as our SSL connection. So if you want to get more, right, we can see that we're dealing with our handshake protocol, the version of transport layer, the size of the packet, our session ID, and then we get into the ciphers where we deal with our AES 256, 128. If we were to go down, you could probably see your triple DES. We see our different algorithms there as well. And you will need to know the differences between like triple DES, maybe not the differences, but you'll at least need to know your SHA, your handshake. Excuse me.
Did they ask anything about like turning off cipher sheets or any of that kind of stuff? Like hardening? That's probably too.
I'll say there's a chance, but I have not seen anything in that area on the test questions or exam. All right, so SSL, transport layer security. Again, you'll see several questions there. Just know the different versions in the cipher. Right? We're dealing with our keys. So we're talking certificates, public key, private key, SSL 1 and 2, not used. 3 is kind of out there, but going away. And then transport 1 and 1.1 have weaknesses, 1.2 ideally, but
Can't even really use 1 and 2, 1.1, really, you can, but
only for like legacy systems but that's where the hardening comes in. Get rid of the stuff we don't need.
with the browsers, like, screaming about it, like, especially when they're just.
Oh, sure. So we still have that scale. If I'm more secure, many times it takes longer to do things. Performance can be degraded because it has to take more time. So if you see a question, they may say you're looking to secure a web page or a network resource. Which of the following would be most secure for something that if it maybe has a legacy hardware? So now when it says legacy, you're going to know it needs to deal with an older version as opposed to a newer. I don't remember having to distinguish between 1, 2, 3. If I see the 3 of them, I obviously know that 3 is newer. 1 and 2 would be less secure or gone at that point. Yeah, and that's true. Sometimes if we do have legacy systems, we have to go in and intentionally enable it as opposed to the default. All right, so ciphers, again, we had a module or a section last week that got into that as well. We have software that can speed up the process for us, accelerator decryptors. I didn't have a question on it, but I mean, the term itself kind of makes sense. I put dedicated resources aside. He did talk about, do we remember the video on Wednesday, the Cisco, where he talked about the ASIC circuit, the ASIC, and if it supports that, then we have that hardware can, in that case, speed up the Cisco device and support that. And then our decryptors can actually go through and now start to inspect traffic that might be encrypted. So we're going to use this for our IDS detection systems, our SIEM, right? SIEM software or SIEM. That's the same SIEM software was that central tool that keeps track of everything for us. The log files and monitoring. It's last Wednesday or Thursday section talked about that.
Just like browse, like that now. Chrome,
Yeah.
they're screaming about it because it knows it's not coming from
Something in between, even though it's not compromised, it's inspected, values could change even though it's an accepted or we know what's going on. So accelerators, decryptors, again, just speeding up the process, as well as decryptors are inspecting more of the traffic or the contents of the traffic for us. Let's block port 80. Please don't. I'm on page 328, but it shows the tab here, Web Security Gateway, right? Again, Internet web server gateway is our connection to and from. We can also deal with, and we've talked about this, we actually got into, we saw it in Active Directory, right, where we can come through and say you can only connect at these times on these days. So through our software, we can now control, we can keep a track on keywords coming through. Also dealing with URLs. Who's using too much? And if you are, I can restrict that. Again, almost always controlled through our third-party software. Firewall, we've dealt with that. And then our unified threat management also brings into that for our intrusion detection prevention systems. So web security, I don't have a web server, I don't deal with it. Somebody else does, you have to deal with it. That's again the cost if you've got your web server.
Wow. I used to manage the scan city.
Did you?
Like, yeah, in the proxies in the cloud. We had a whole bunch of these for different offices and point to.
And most of this software is nice because it gives us nice log files or charts. And we can see here, we see a couple different options. We see our dashboard, what antivirus, our spyware, web filtering. And so we can go through and monitor that.
And they got one.
Did they? You'll see SMTP as well as your secure SMTP. Possibly you have to know the port 465. We need to know port 25. We talked about, when we got into Windows Server, we got into DNS, we saw that there was an MX record, right? So our mail exchange record, that tells us where our email server is. SMTP, again, something we need to have open if we're going to deal with it, but we also want to monitor these things carefully. If you're dealing with Microsoft's product, it is Exchange Server. So the next several pages bookmark because they talk about secure SMTP, POP3 secure, secure IMAP, right? POP3, dealing with just that, our post office box or post office protocol, simple protocol. Basically, each device is separate from the other. When we deal with our IMAP, I can now create folders, and if I log in or log into that particular email account, it retains that folder structure. Years ago, if I wanted to have somebody host my email and I had somebody in town, I would have to specifically say I am using IMAP or POP3, and then they would set it up for us that way. So we had to go in and make a specific decision on the type of email that we support. And we may have to do that some today. So secure SMTP, secure POP, secure IMAP, you'll see questions on those too. You'll need to remember 110 for POP. You probably need to know 995 for secure POP. IMAP, you'll probably need to know 143 and 993 for secure IMAP. So those are some of the ports you will want to remember. Still dealing with some email servers. Just know that when we enable our filtering, whether it's on my local machine or else, the tighter the filter, the less email I will get. Or potential valid email I would get, because it's basically filtering a lot more things. So make sure that as far as your spam filters go, just realize that I'm either, most likely this is again going to be on my Exchange server or my email server, more on the outside, right? More on the perimeter. Filters mail before it gets to the web server or the email server. So now I'm filtering on my machine. So I go into Outlook and I configure my spam. settings. Proactive and reactive, I think, right? We set it up so we don't have a lot of junk email, or I suddenly start getting a lot of junk, so I turn it on. So again, you may see spam filters on your test, but you will see stuff on your email server and hardening that. MIME is an extension for our email. Big thing to know with MIME is we're dealing with a certificate. So we are using certificates for SMIME. So you may see a test question that talks about which of the following protocols would you use if you are running a certificate authority, and you would need to kind of at least put the 2 and 2 together. The SMIME requires or uses certificates somewhere in the question. And as you go through the question, you'll start to see different words that pop out. Okay, so they are a certificate authority. That tells you a clue. They are running Active Directory. They are hosting their own email. There's our FTP. We already talked about that, but that's towards the very end. Our FTP, FTPS, port 20 done. Bless you. VoIP. I'll do this and we'll give you guys a break. All right, so our PBX, basically if we're hosting our own service or not, as far as VoIP solutions, typically when we deal with VoIP, we are also dealing with VLAN, so we have a separate VLAN for our specific voice over IP conversation. When we deal with voice over IP, we are typically dealing with 1 or 2 different protocols. We have our SIP protocol, and a part of that is when you have a particular user or a particular phone, we are going to have our SIP address, SIP number, and if you look, the third to last page there, I'm on 339, talks about your voice over IP. It talks about SIP, Session Initiation Protocol. So the way it's written, we see SIP:andy.warner@bootcamp. SIP with a number at that address, or email at that address. SIP, andy.warner at that number. Meet SIP organizer, then more information there. Who here works with voice over IP or does this configuring, setting up? All of you?
And other people.
Okay. But they're going to, if you do it all the time, you know, okay, I need A, B, C, D, and then I put those values in, and then we're going to go through and use those. One of the other things we talk about, real-time protocols. What's QoS? It's one of the things we want here. Okay. And how does quality of service basically work?
Basically qualifies the packet, determines whether it's gold or base prioritizes.
There you go, prioritizes. Sometimes you can actually, if you have the software, you can actually dedicate a portion of the network. I want 20% of the network reserved just for this conversation. The downside there is if nobody's talking, you've still got that percentage being not utilized as opposed to used elsewhere. But typically the way it works is each packet has part of its identifier, and it's saying this is a priority packet. When the router sees it, if there's a priority packet, they jump to the front of the line. And that helps get rid of our stutter, our jitter, those kind of things. The problem we have, if we're watching the news, right, the news guys over in Afghanistan, we have learned to expect that when the guy here asks a question, we're going to wait 5, 6, 7 seconds, and then finally he hears it. So there is that delay. The jitter would be once we hear him, that conversation starts to break up. But when we see it on the news, there's usually a delay, but once he's talking, we don't have any sort of discrepancy. He or she still can give their report and say what they need to. So a lot of the things that we're going to set up and configure as far as our quality of service is to help get rid of any of those excess pieces. Buffering helps. A lot of that set up automatically. So we have our SIP, RTP, secure SIP. VoIP is almost always going to be internal on our network. You will need to know quality of service. I don't know if you'll need to know the specifics of SIP, except knowing that it is dealing with voice over IP, real-time protocol. And so we're getting into our different settings and values there as far as our entries. And real-time tells us that it's live, it's real-time. Default gateway, that's the IP address for me to leave the network. We're still using the same term gateway here, which is how I get out of my network segment. So here we're dealing with media, voice over video conversations. That's not something I don't remember seeing the test question, but just know that when we're dealing with our unified communications, we're almost always dealing with messaging, combining messages together for efficiency, for speed. And that's the last page or two there. So I talked too much for that, sorry. Anyway, kind of went through, said some of the specific things. Mike, thanks for pointing it out too when you see them on the test. And once you start going through the test questions, you'll start to see, oh, we did talk about that, or oh, I at least recognize that.
And I noticed that it's like authentication, optimization, and the AAA.
Yep.
Those are definitely on there.
Yep.
All three. Which one is which?
Authenticating, authorizing, and accounting. All right, thanks for your patience. Take a break, come back, I guess, round 3, and then we'll get into our remote access and our design.
Some of these questions, it's really hard to say. That's I agree.
Deeper and
You find it could, like, like get more smaller butchers.
we were talking about the one on Fairview, across from the cemetery there, kind of on Cloverdale. That's been around for a long time.
But it still doesn't taste the same, and then you gotta have the grass fed.
If I can't hear a cow mooing, it's like, so I married an axe murderer. I told my daughter this morning, I'm like, you have to watch So I Married an Axe Murderer with me. She's like, huh? I go, she probably would hate it, but I think it's classic.
Yeah.
It's got its own weather system. Look at the size of that noggin. All right, I got to stay away from movies. Last thing, we did watch Venom over the weekend. It's pretty good. Yeah. Funny. Tom Hardy's character, I like his style character. There's some cool effects. All right, remote access. We'll quickly get done while Pam's gone. Not in a bad way. but getting a headway. All right. So install, configure remote access VPNs, IPsec. So some of this has come up in conversation and go into a little bit more detail. And then getting into some of our remote desktops. So when we talk our remote access, we're almost always dealing with, right, so we've got our HQ, and then I have Pocatello, and then I have a user. So when we're dealing with our VPN, it's almost always going to be a user or a site-to-site type connection. The user is typically going to be brought up and torn down as we connect and disconnect. The site is almost always up all the time to at least allow. And this is also what we're dealing with, right? We hear that term WAN link. That's almost always going to be what we're seeing with there. PPP, we have PPTP and L2TP. So we have our point-to-point protocol. PPTP is our point-to-point tunneling protocol, right? So we're creating this tunnel. And then L2 is our layer 2, tunneling protocol. And with L2TP, we can now use Ethernet, frame relay, ATM. What's ATM? It's a WAN link, asynchronous transfer mode. Speeds up to 622 megs. So we still see them, but that's kind of the old, years ago, we used to get into our, those types of connections when we needed real high speed. It was extremely expensive. So when we deal with our L2TP, we have quite a bit more versatility. And with L2TP, we are also using IPsec. And we've learned, we know and we have learned IPsec is the standard in high-level security and encryption, because IPsec is an internet protocol, so we know there's a set of rules, and then we use it for our smart cards, our VPNs, our different types of authentication there. So when we get remote access, right, between two offices or home, problems, you almost always have to have a client installed to connect. Citrix is a big one. Cisco has them. Most firewall products have a VPN solution, and it's typically licensing, so you can buy 10 licenses, 50 licenses, whatever you need to. I know Western States has problems with their Citrix client. Whenever they update their firewall, they have to go update Citrix, and then they also send out emails to everybody. And of course, late at night, once everybody's gotten the emails, everybody says, hey, I can't connect. Well, you got to read the rules. Sometimes when you go to hotels, if you need to create a VPN, you cannot do it. We typically have gone to Marriott, and there's, in many cases, or some cases, you just call the front desk, give them your MAC address, tell them what they need, and they will open up the port so you can create a VPN. So it's not there by default because they're hardening their network. They've got a Marriott hotel in San Francisco, 15 stories, 150 different places on a story. You've got all types of people. You got your conferences, good people, bad people, everything in between. The one TED Talk, the hacker comes in and was saying, I guess that's back when they had the ordering system through your TV and the satellite, whatever it was. And he was able to change every single person's TV in the hotel just because of the way he hacked into it. So we need to be careful. Dial-up modems, again, our lease line. And then we can also get into other types. Nowadays, we're seeing a lot more of the DSL cable. We've got DSL, we've got cable here, and they have a business line. So it's still cable one, it's just a 300 meg connection. But at home, I've got 100 meg down, 50 meg up, 50, 60 bucks a month. We've been talking about that. I could get a gigabit at home. We're almost always breaking it down into these two areas as well. I've got internet at home, and then I've got internet at work. And how do we handle those differently? A lot of times business solutions as opposed to our residential. Right, PPP, point-to-point protocol. You'll see several questions on these. We did talk about this last week in the week before. We have our tunneling, and one of the words you will typically see is called encapsulation. Basically, each packet is encapsulated, wrapped with information, and as it goes from layer 7 down to layer 1, out there through the physical line, and then unwrapped from layer 1 up to layer 7, that's what we're seeing as we go through there. Can I set up a VPN on my land or in my own land?
Can, but
Sure.
really, it's hard because you gotta go in and out of come back in.
So we're typically not going to use a VPN, but I can still enable IPsec on computers. So in Windows, I can go to Jeremy's computer, let's say he's HR, and he's working on a special project with Jess over in accounting. And we have decided through our meetings that we need more security for that project for the next 2 months. So I can go to their machine, turn on IPsec, and now they can talk to each other with a tunnel internally, just not using a VPN tunnel. Now, we have a couple options with IPsec. I'm going to write them, but it's not the right term. But I have require. Actually, they are. So Jeremy has IPsec, and I set it to require. Jess has IPsec, I set it to require. Now, they can only talk using IPsec. So if they need to have a normal conversation, this will not work because it's only IPsec. So obviously it's the most secure, but it's also the most controlling because it limits everything else. So you have to either turn it on or off. So we have require, I have request, right? So maybe he requires it or he requests it, and then she can say, hey, I do have it, and I will respond. Basically, when we request it, we're saying the default or preferred conversation is IPsec, but I can have others. So we have require, we have request, and we have respond, which is just that. So our most secure, in between, and then our least secure. Can't talk, except an IPsec. My default is to try IPsec. Here, if you're talking, I will respond, but normally I'm not going to deal with IPsec. Those are the 3 options that we typically have internally on our network. Any special stories or experiences with VPNs, whether site to site or client? I think most of us at some point have seen them, worked on them, used them. A lot of it will depend on the client. If you're using Citrix, right, you're going to have to configure Citrix a little bit different than you might a Cisco client. Point-to-point tunneling protocol. Excuse me. So you will see your VPN, remote access or site-to-site. Just know that those are the 2 differences. You will need to know point-to-point tunneling protocol. Right? So we have our point-to-point. It's still encapsulation. By default, it uses Microsoft's encryption. Link is negotiated. Link negotiating is not encrypted, allows sniffing. So with PPTP, once we connect, we're encrypted. But the initial trying to connect is not encrypted. So somebody could sniff that initial piece out. TCP port 1723, maybe, maybe not. Basically, we need to have certain ports open if we're using point-to-point. So point-to-point tunneling protocol, again, you'll see that. And we saw it quite a bit earlier. Now we've gone to our L2TP, which is our layer 2 tunneling protocol. So we're talking down at the MAC address layer, physical address. Cisco uses it, but a lot of other products use it too. Citrix, others, right? We already said if I'm using L2TP, I can use frame relay, Ethernet, ATM, Sonnet rings. So if we have different public WAN solutions, L2TP is going to be much more important, especially when we're going our site to site. Right? Because site to site is almost always going through some sort of a public exchange, some sort of a provider. This is also the other big one. So when you see the test questions, if you see IPsec, it has to be layer 2. PPTP will not work with IPsec. That's just Microsoft's solution. And the other nice part here, if I go back one slide, right? The negotiation, so as we're creating that VPN connection, that initial, yes, Kyle, are you there, right? That is not encrypted. So somebody could sniff out some of that. So that's PPTP. My L2TP, that whole piece is encrypted now, right? Because we're layer 2 down at the physical address. So we're talking tunneling from physical address to physical address. Port 1701, maybe, maybe not. But you will see a couple questions on PPTP, L2TP, point-to-point protocol. Just know the significant differences there. IPsec, non-IPsec, or Microsoft's encryption. Link is encrypted. PPTP is not encrypted. L2TP works with multiple frame types, right? Frame, relay, ATM, Ethernet. PPTP is not, it is limited. Okay. Transport layer security. This is a term, bookmark this because you will see several questions on TLS. We saw it last week, right? AES with TLS. So AES, the authentication encryption service, AES dealing with our transport layer security. So another thing here, we're dealing with certificates. So just know that with our AES VPN, we almost always are now saying I have some sort of a smart card or a secure ID I have to plug in. So when we talk TLS VPN, it's almost a piece of hardware that I have to use for the VPN, as opposed to just connecting to the internet, wireless or through Ethernet. Now we have to plug in a smart card or something else to get into our TLS. For you guys at Nampa City, what do you do for VPNs? I know we've kind of talked about it a little bit.
Cisco.
Okay. Roughly how many VPN connections are out there? Or roughly how many people have the ability to use a VPN? Okay, few?
More than that.
Okay. You guys, I assume?
Yeah.
Admin? Who else would by default be allowed to use a VPN? Okay. If I have a laptop, if I work at home or I'm promoted, would I have to do something else to get a VPN? Fill out a form, do some sort of a request? Okay, so there's some sort of a approval process.
And typically like the IT director, because it depends on your pay rate as well.
Okay. Can police use VPNs?
Hopefully not, but they do. I know that some of them do. Very good.
What about with their squad cars? How are they connected?
That's different. That's just on the cellular network.
It is? Okay.
Yeah, so it's a whole different.
Okay.
It's not traditional. We use another program.
Okay.
It's not,
Okay. I was curious about that.
but it is in the sense.
So they're using like a Verizon or some sort of a
Yeah, they're using like third
BIOS or whatever.
Yeah, and it is much more tolerant of lapses in coverage and stuff like
Sure.
that. It's able to
Okay.
buffer and all that stuff to maintain the connection.
And a lot of that can be configured as well. Okay. um, I don't remember seeing always on. I was checking my notes. So sometimes we'll see an always on, which is here. So basically there's always a connection, but as long as there's data being transmitted, then the connection will stay up. So the cost there is we're always up, as opposed to if we're paying based on bandwidth, then that could be an issue. So we can set that up. We have our split tunnel and we have our full tunnel. Split tunnel is right here, right? So we're dealing site to site. And with my split tunnel, I'm allowing VPN connections as well as other services through that connection. Okay, and then the full tunnel is full internet access controlled by corporate. Do you remember seeing questions on that, Mike?
What's that?
Split tunnel, full tunnel? I didn't.
I didn't see, I've been through all the, at least October and September. I don't think I saw one. Might be one kind of related, but.
IPsec. We've seen that a lot, probably half a dozen times already. It's been in different modules. Network Plus, you'll see it. Security Plus, you'll see it. Microsoft classes, you'll see it. And we have two types. You might need to know these two. You have the authentication header, which is basically the connection is authenticated, but not necessarily the payload. And then we have our ESP, the encapsulation payload. That's where the authentication and the payload is completely encrypted. So you might see more of a scenario question where they're talking about running IPsec. You need to make sure that the entire packet is encrypted as opposed to just the authentication. And so that would be your authentication header. Again, the term itself makes sense. Okay, I'm just authenticating the header, not the payload, as opposed to encapsulating the entire payload. So you may need to know both of those. And then they have little diagrams there as far as the header or the entire payload as well. Transport mode with ESP or with your AH. Okay. Internet key exchange. We're dealing with our certificates. We almost always have some sort of a shared secret that we're dealing with here as well. Just know with our IKE, our Internet Key Exchange, certificates are involved, or we can have that key, or where was Cerberus again? Where do we see that authentication? Active Directory. It varies. I used to say Kerberos, and then the last year or two, I've for some reason switched to Cerberus. Actually, I used to say Kerberos. I guess I can go to Google Translate and see what they say. Right, you will need to know the Internet Key Exchange, dealing with certificates. I want to say not last week, the week before, there was a whole part or a whole couple units talking about certificate authority, public, private, Okay, that's where we're dealing with this. So kind of, again, I don't know what module that is, but tie it into that for your key exchange. All right. Remote access servers. How do you guys deal with remote access? You guys are running Radius. What products do you use for remote access? I think you said some of them. Which TeamViewer? Okay. I used to use LogMeIn. It was great. It was free. They had clients for everything, and then they started charging, and I've never used it again. But I use, again, some third-party tools. I use remote desktop connection when I'm here at work. But that's just when I'm internal on my own network.
Or Citrix.
Yep. The other, geez, come on. It's on my other screen. It won't move over. And it's locked. So I'll use remote desktop internally. That has been on our machines, I believe, since Windows XP. I don't know about 2000, but I know in Windows XP, the remote desktop connection came in. The one I use right now, have been using, is called Splashtop. And they have a client that's out there. I've got it on my Android. There's Apple. I've got it set up on my computer in the next room. It's a fairly lightweight client. And there's two parts. So there's a tool that lets me administer all the devices, and then all I have to do is have the other piece running in the background. So as long as I set it up, if I reboot my system to start on boot up, then I'm good. But that's one that I've used the last couple years. Had my dad install it so I can remote in there if I need to. Seems to work fairly well on my mobile device as well as tablets. But we're all going to have kind of one that we like or are forced to use with work. They're all basically the same. Licensing could be an issue, whether it's a resident or personal use or corporate use. Most of the configurations, right, they're going to give you options for how does the video load, what type of options as far as your double tap or your swipe on your screens. How long am I going to stay connected after not being used? All right, so it's also becoming much more common now that we've got much more access to the internet and connectivity. Remote access solutions become key. CenturyLink for years did not allow people to work from home. Now they do, as long as they have a work computer that's taken home with them. IT, I believe, still actually goes home with them, sets up their VPN, and they actually have, certain people can actually do split shifts. So they'll work from 6 to 10, and then again from 4 to 8 in the evening, and they just remote in. And when people dial in for support, they just get added into the queue, and they'll get the calls or not based on that. Personally, I like working from home sometimes. I'm more productive when I can physically be there. That's just me. It's hard for me to wake up, walk down the stairs, sit at a desk, and just work.
There's too much else to do.
There was on the radio, this lady was calling and complaining because her husband expected her to, cook and do dishes and laundry because she's at home. And she's like, yeah, but I'm working from home. It's not like I'm home doing everything else. And they were kind of saying, well, just let them know that from 9 to 5, yes, you are physically home, but you're not. You're working. What the most recent I've used it is when Jess and I had the Network Plus and I was sick. So that was, we'll say that was a health reason. But that was an advantage because I could, at the first day, I'm like, hey, I'm wearing shorts, just so you know. I never get to wear shorts when I teach, so today and the next 2 weeks. So that was very convenient. The first day it took, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes to make sure we got the Zoom set up or the Adobe Connect, whatever tool we were using, the headphones. I was able to kind of set up ahead of time some videos that she could watch on break. But when we had breaks, 10, 15 minutes, you could pause your video, pause your sound. And I was able to still do the desktop, things there. So for me, that's the most recent time I've had to use it. So it was definitely convenient where I didn't get people sick, but could also still do my job.
Working in underwear is the best.
Sure.
Until somebody like the system, I just speaking from experience, and something's broken, you gotta go on site.
Well, there was,
There in 20 minutes, we have to get dressed.
during football yesterday, there was one of the commercials was the guy was in a meeting with a dress shirt and tie, and then the laptop fell off his thing, and it shows him in his boxers, and he's like, own it. That's why I said first thing, hey, I'm wearing shorts, so I set the expectation. But there's obviously good and bad. It's more likely going to be a company decision. Do you trust the people that if they're home, they're actually working and doing the things that they need to? If you're the type of business that is, as long as you get your job done, you can do it in 5 hours, 10 hours, 2 hours, whatever it is, as opposed to making sure you're busy 24/7 doing what you need to. And through those types of connections, you can still do some monitoring and things to keep track of. So remote access servers. Telnet, you will see a question on this. Getting into our remote tools. Right, I showed you when we saw the Cisco video, he was using PuTTY. That was a tool that he installed to remotely configure routers and switches. If not, he could open up the command line, open up a telnet session, so he could telnet into that router, just standard telnet, clear text, right? So maybe not the preferred. If we want it to be secure, then we would go through and use our secure telnet, or we use another product. In fact, I wonder if we have PuTTY on here. I don't think so. When you connect using PuTTY, it actually tells you what type of connection, telnet, secure telnet, SSH, and so you can actually choose the type that you want to. And had I just read the slide, I could show you. All right, so this is PuTTY. I'm not sure what version they're at. Just go to Google, search for PuTTY for Cisco or for remote admin. So we've got several options. We can deal with our session, the terminal, appearance, connection. So right here, what type of connection? Is it telnet, our login? Is this, what's a serial connection? Using an actual serial port or serial cable. If we looked, I don't have it here anymore.
RS-232.
Some of them have that blue console port, and some still have serial. He talked about in the video where you can have different modules too, where you can install fiber connections or those kind of things. So we can come through here. We have to identify the port, the IP address, and then what particular type are we doing? Just a standard clear telnet, or are we getting up into the SSH for secure? May have to know port 2223 is your telnet. In fact, I would bookmark that one in your brain. 2223 for your telnet. And you will see questions on Telnet as well. Both Net Plus and Security Plus. Remember port 3389. That's for the remote desktop protocol. And here, right, when we try to connect, we can go through. So when we connect remotely, we typically have two options. I can do admin mode, where I'm going in fixing things, or I can actually take over the desktop so the user can actually see the session and see what I'm doing. I like to kind of bring that more into like a training mode, where now I can say, okay, when I'm talking about going to control panels and making this change, you go here, right click here, go here and change this setting kind of a thing. So we can use it for that. So remote desktop protocol 3389, and that's the one that's that we use internally for remote desktop. Hardening, questions on that? That's come up several times. So far, we've talked about hardening our domain controller. This morning we talked, or this afternoon, hardening our web server, hardening our email server. Can I harden clients? Sure. Maybe not as necessary as far as the critical nature of things compared to hardening our server that everybody accesses. It still isn't bad for your client workstations. If they don't need things installed, don't have them installed. If they don't need Flash, don't install Flash. If they don't need Adobe Acrobat, then don't put it on. So when we talk about hardening our remote access server, we're still dealing with our software updates, patches. So this is almost always included in patch management. Now here they bring up client, because if I'm at home using remote desktop to connect somewhere else, I still need to make sure my client is somewhat protected. So the client as well as the server for our remote access. All right, questions? Comments, observations, good, bad, indifferent with remote access. Good experiences, typically, not bad. I'll tell you what, it's a lot easier than having your phone send you an email or a text that something just broke at 2 in the morning, and the fact that you can almost literally just pull your phone, put a pillow under your head and do what you need to. If at that point you can't, then maybe you can go in. 10, 15, 20 years ago, I was in the car, I was going. I had to worry about so many other things. My UPS system, I have to have it configured so that if it sends a brownout or a blackout, I was getting notified and those kinds of things. So the good is the convenience factor. I can do an awful lot with it. For me, here at work, I set it up for LAN connection so I get the full all the graphics, I get all the images, all the effects. If you don't have those speeds, then we would obviously keep it pretty lean. All right. Anything else for remote access? If you have any other tools you really like I said, I use Splashtop if you want to give it a try, see what you think. For me, the big thing is free initially.
Freeze.
It's called beta mode. Close. Windows 7. Looks the same. That is the old back.
It is.
That is, isn't it?
I used to have that, like, with the clouds and the
All right. All right, we'll get into design. We've talked about this as well. Here we're getting into physical. I knew this would be fairly quick. This is the 90%, right? 5% black, 5% white, 90%. Mike does it one way, Jeremy does it one way. They can both work, but how do we make it more effective or the best for our environment, experience, rules, policies, lots of different things there. So some of these terms we've talked about. I'll just blitz through them. Like I said earlier, if we keep hearing the same terms over and over, that's because it's important. I don't have to tell you it's on the test. Just know that, oh, we've heard IPsec 3 or 4 times. It's going to be there. It's important. All right. Let's see what the ISO standard is. So Pam, how do you know to come up with the policies that you do or you hope to?
It depends on what's happening in the city, but it's also gone back to my previous days, other jobs where these are the standard policies that need to be in place to begin with.
Okay.
And then kind of looking to what we're going forward to. Okay, we're going to go with mobile devices. Yes, we need to be policy in place, but we can't enforce it.
Okay.
That kind of stuff.
That's the key. The key thing I was looking for was your experience. We do things a certain way because of our good and bad experiences, or we've learned from other people's experiences. Having the dynamics of your admin group or your admin team. Someone's proficient in group policy, GPO, somebody else in Radius, somebody else in DNS and other services there. So when we deal with our setting up our environment, it's experience. I just went to, in the book, it talks about our ISO standards. So I just said 15408, which is the one they talked about, the electronic version of the standard that can be downloaded. It establishes general concepts and principles of IT security evaluation and a general model that you can follow. So if we're not sure, do I have to buy it? If we're not sure, we can almost always find some sort of a white paper. Most of the big companies publish this stuff and make it public. So they're going to give you their design or their model for security. Cisco, any of those big companies are going to have something like that in place. Schema. Now see, this one goes on. A lot. All right, so we either go based on experience. Cisco Security Design, PDF. So secure blueprint for the enterprise. Cisco, designing your perimeter security. Your Cisco design services. So if I go here, again, I just show you how easy we can find it. So Cisco Safe, a security blueprint for enterprise networks. It's 67 pages long. Architecture, your design fundamentals. What are some of the threats, the different modules, building it, server, your edge. Corporate, here they have VPN, remote access. You've got our WAN, e-commerce, on and on and on. And again, it's just PDF. Designing perimeter security. This is 720 pages, also by Cisco. This is from 15 years ago, so that's old. This one is even older. Looking for something that's newer. This one's 4 pages. 2006, newer of the two. So this one here, Cisco Security Design Services. So Pam uses experience. Some of that experience can also be endorsed or supported by other companies producing or at least publishing what their security models are. Some companies are specific, like Cisco has different parts of their company that are specific to designing a secure infrastructure. So you can bring in a consultant or somebody like that as well. If in doubt, search. There's lots that you can find. And that Security Plus folder I shared with you will have a lot of that stuff in it. Who hasn't had that yet, by the way? Did you get yours, Pam? That email for the Security Plus folder?
Yeah, I got it from Jeff.
Okay. Because you sent me an email.
I don't think I did.
Okay. I'll,
Then I have it, but I don't remember getting it from you.
okay. If not, I'll resend it.
I didn't. Yeah, I mean, I did. I'll get that.
Yeah, I got
You wanna walk
it
home?
from Kyle.
That'd be a good walk.
Hey, or you could just stay. We're doing the Certified Ethical Hacker tonight.
That would be fun.
If you want to stay here till 9 o'clock.
Oh. It's all right, I can listen to you. Oh, hey. Helping here.
I got peach pants.
I guess you.
Peeps. All right. So,
That's what she said I was gonna pay.
she is an Uber. Are you still doing that?
Yeah, I do know. I did it this Friday.
How was it?
It's good.
Love
6
it.
hours, $185.
Not bad. Not bad at all. All right, Trusted OS, computing group. I'm not going to worry about that. It's basically who are we trusting? How do we trust? There's policies that will do that. We talked, I will say this, last week or the week before, we talked about federation services, right? It's where our organization can build a trust with another organization, right? So that's building into this particular piece here. Remember, we talked about the two trusts. I have a transitive trust that's because the parent has a child and that child has a child. The trust goes up by default. With federations, I have to create a one-way trust and another one-way trust if I want to go both ways. Questions on upgrading your hardware firmware? What was the TPM? Net Plus, Security Plus, you will see that. I saw this on my test. That's that hardware chip. I think we pulled up a couple images where it's a physical hardware piece that is dealing with security at the motherboard, at the physical layer there as well. BIOS, UEFA. How often do we get into our BIOS? Well, let me ask you this. Why do you typically have to get into your BIOS or your UEFA? Troubleshooting? Set your boot order sometimes. Am I going to boot to USB? Am I going to boot to network? Am I going to boot to CD, DVD, ROM?
Enable legacy.
Okay, enable legacy boot. The nice thing, now what's the big difference between the BIOS and the UEFA? Which is new? UEFA. One of the big things to know, UEFA has the 64-bit support. And that's one of the bigger things. Not that BIOS doesn't, but with the UEFA, we have a lot more configuration options. And through our UEFA, we can sometimes, many times, we can still have mouse movements and visual control as opposed to you have to kind of do the old DOS, go to 6 and then go down to 1 and hit the up arrow to move it up or down. How often do we have to update our software in the BIOS or UEFA? Yearly? Every other year? If you go look, Dell, they probably don't even have firmware updates except every 2-3 years, depending on significant issues. What's that? Yeah, and we can, sometimes when typically when I do troubleshooting and it's very extensive, a lot of times they'll say this feature should be fixed using updating the BIOS, and then I'll check the versions and see where I'm at compared to where I should be. Just like upgrading every other piece of software, we typically get more features, more security, more options there. All right, so you'll most likely need that, BIOS, UEFI, legacy boot, secure boot, right? We can boot with networking. Sometimes we can choose to boot without all of our drivers. And that's typically if we've got problems, hardware problems, driver problems, install the bad drivers. BitLocker, EFS, you'll see that on the test. BitLocker encrypts the entire drive. EFS does the file or folder. You'll also see a question with the recovery agent. Remember, we create a recovery agent. That's the first thing we want to do, because when somebody uses EFS, that recovery agent's key is put into that option. If you do the recovery agent afterwards, and let's say that person encrypted a file or a folder, leaves, and if you do not have a recovery agent, you will have problems. So just kind of remember when you, and again, this is Killian, it's Monday. Oh, let's go create a new domain. Oh, let's go, install. So we're not typically dealing with that. But the first time we do it, that's what we want to do. What are our main peripherals? Mouse, keyboard. I've got a digital camera. My laptop has cameras built into it. Any other significant peripheral devices besides printers? Monitors, good. Docking station, very good. Hard drives. External data sources. Yep. Coffee holder, yep.
USB
Christmas lights.
Those are set.
USB Christmas lights.
Well, there is the one guy in Meridian is like nationally recognized for his Christmas light show.
Yeah, they're not plugged into this computer.
What's that?
I said I'm pretty sure they're not plugged into this computer.
Yeah, I don't know how they are.
To his computer in the sense that they like music and shit.
I think just configuring it, he does that, but
Not a USB Christmas lights. Correct. That's in there.
all right, so
I'm sure.
sheet dip, external devices, wireless keyboards. So we need to worry about like keyloggers, things like that. Those are our devices. Displays, printers, wireless enabled micro SD cards or Wi-Fi, digital cameras. Anyway, a lot of times when we're dealing with peripherals, it's a physical thing. Who's physically connected? Who's physically installed software? My USB drive has to be done physically. I can't, virtually say, hey, let's plug in this USB drive and make it work. Baseline, we've talked about that. Install secure configurations. Again, don't have ports used open that we're not using. Services, don't install them if you don't need them. Interfaces. On my machine, I've got one NIC, and I've got like 3 or 4 virtual NICs from VMware. So you be mindful and remember those things. All right. Questions on hardening the workstation? Okay. Patches, updates, again, same type of things. I think we're more concerned with the servers because many people connect to them, and if somebody does compromise those, there's more damage done as opposed to an individual workstation. Personal firewall, right? We can enable that on our machine. Typically, I do not, and because we have a network-based, host-based network-based firewall solution. But I will tell my mom and dad to turn it on because they have nothing else in between there. So workstation hardening. Server hardening, same thing.
Kiosks, we talked about kiosks.
Do you guys have kiosks?
Yes.
Are you? For customers or patients or people?
Patients, users,
Okay.
yes, at different locations, because that's all we need to do. Like the golf course, for instance.
Okay. Okay, yeah, that's where you see it.
Right.
I see, like you go to buy a car, they have all their little kiosk displays and things. And every once in a while, now, what type of operating system do we typically see on a kiosk? Windows Embedded is typically the version for the kiosk because there's other things there. But you can also install Windows 10 and use group policy to give you the same type of security effect.
That's
So-
the one, so long.
A lot, it'll take longer and there's more, as opposed to using the embedded operating system that it's built for that functionality, as opposed to a full workstation operating system that I'm trying to drill down to that.
We use software locked in.
Which is pretty cool.
Is it?
No, it's just a bunch of marketing, you know, we use a free, which is really good.
There you go.
It's not, but you don't have to.
Yeah, well,
I did create it, I gotta give it back from Joe. He's
Exactly.
He's my name, I'm not. Maybe that's a fear.
So Windows management control panels, management consoles like this, we're living in there now. Group policy objects, looks, okay, we've seen those for Active Directory, and then our server management. So most of what we're dealing on the Windows side is getting into our management console, our dashboard, and then administering the different services. And then we can come in here and based on what's installed, I have my DHCP or my DNS or my Active Directory users and computers. As a network administrator, the Microsoft server is in more organizations than probably any other server product. So if you play the number game, you want to know Microsoft server or at least basic administration for Windows. Linux, Unix, there's an advantage to having one Microsoft operating system. There's an advantage for Apple having Windows X or 10, whatever the new one is for their iPhone. But there's also a disadvantage because there's just one version. If you go to Android, Android has become so popular because I can use it on dozens and dozens and dozens of different devices. But now I have to worry, what flavor do you have? What version do you have? Not only that, Verizon is going to, or LG is going to have a different flavor of Oreo than Samsung will have for Oreo. So there's a lot of different things that we have to deal with and work with there. Same with Linux. What flavor are you running? Right? Windows Server, one thing. Is it data center? Is it advanced server? Okay. That becomes easy. Linux, am I dealing with OpenSUSE, Red Hat, Debian, Ubuntu, whatever, and now I have to deal with different patches and updates there. Windows Update, patch management. Who has installed Linux distros? Okay.
That's as far as I got though.
Did you play around with it at all?
A little bit.
A little bit.
Mainly, I was like, not what I'm doing.
Did you do it in GUI mode or core, like the non-graphical command line mode?
Playing around with it?
Installing it. Because you can, like for Ubuntu, I can install Ubuntu Server,
Right.
which by default does not have a GUI interface.
No, I installed it.
And there's, what are the, there's KDE is a big one. You can download different desktops, XF or X4, so there's a couple big ones there. So we have a couple options there. End of life, good. All right. Anyway, I'll let you go. Patch management. We talked about that. We will also talk about that again. And then your embedded systems. That's where you have system on a chip. You've got RTOS. That's our voice over IP solution. The bigger problem now is the home security systems, right? I can have a device that connects to my doorbell. I can now control my thermostat. So this is a whole new area where people could hack into and do certain things through those means there. Internet of Things. All right, well, and then also they talk about wearable devices. I think I saw an NCIS where some guy hacked in and triggered some guy's pacemaker because they had a wireless connection and killed the guy.
Yeah, I've heard about people.
You know, though, NPR just had a thing today.
So we have what's that?
NPR, they put a thing out today, like an article about sweets. And they're like implanting their hands with it. That's putting it in their hands.
I've seen some stuff for access, building access.
Yeah, and like, getting into their homes and like payments and stuff like that.
I think it can be great, but I think we're too in its infancy. I'd want it to be working a little bit better. Yes.
So how accurate are the questions on the CERT exam?
Good.
Well, like because it just like this
Pretty
one
much.
definitely wrong. I mean, it's saying that
Those twos, right? Sure.
after browsing for 20 minutes, a full screen message appears as you tweet in your browser. Windows critical error code and the help desk number call, right? The message plays over the laptop speaker saying there's a critical error, and it says after
Like right there.
restarting the computer,
Now they're saying it's gonna hit like right.
it rectifies the issue. The issue's fixed.
Right.
Okay.
But the answer is supposed to be ransom.
Wow.
That doesn't make any sense.
Because ransomware it encrypts the
It
file.
encrypts the file unless you pay for it, and that was not.
And the answer says ransomware?
I picked
They're
address
saying
because that's what it's
Okay.
but it says the answer ransom.
That one says ransomware. I know that we get it from a guy, a security guy down in California. And Jason, I've done it a little bit, but Jason almost always goes through and tries to verify them. So some of them may.
Correctly on the test and get it wrong.
Well, I was telling Mike this. We have had all but 2 people fail using that as is.
I don't know. I still would not pick ransomware on the actual test. That's not.
Did you Google the question? Because Mike and I last week, they were talking about a service account as far as the type of access. And so once we looked online, it made sense. But the way the question asked it, it did not make sense.
There's another one that talks about.
Well, yeah, but I would say for the most part, we go through and try to make sure they're as accurate as can be. And so far, people are passing it
Are
based
these
on that.
legitimate test questions then? I mean, you're getting them from a source that is legitimate.
Mm-hmm. When you take the test, you will probably recognize half of the questions verbatim. Out of 70 or 82 questions, you'll see 40 to 60 that are immediately recognizable by default, as is. That's why Scott says just memorize. That's why the cook out at the Mountain Home Air Force Base passes it, because he just memorized it. That gets the test, but that doesn't help you in the real world in any way.
What are the prerequisites for the certified hacker?
It would be networking background, possibly Security Plus.
I would imagine you would need some sort of foothold in Linux. Kali. I mean, you need
Yeah, Kali comes in a little bit later. We do some labs with that as well. But it gets more into, so we have a little discussion and then labs where you're actually getting into penetration testing, those kind of things. But I think if you have a decent networking background with possibly a little bit of security background, you would be okay.
We've got
It's one of the best certs out there now. That and Sec Plus, this one.
we've got a coworker that's got the Security Plus and then certified ethical hacker, and he said that,
You have to get ethical background?
Yeah.
Why? Okay.
and he said that that he felt that the test required a lot of knowledge about the different applications of Kali. He said that you had to have a pretty good working knowledge about it.
Well, and it may depend on the background. Jason took it, said it was one of the easiest ones he's taken.
Oh.
But
He said it was
he's,
harder than Security Plus.
see,
So I guess it might just depend.
a lot of it will depend, but I do know that the test is done through a different group. So it's not done through our Pearson VUE. So when you take the test, you actually have a proctor at iCounsel. You have to take your video camera and pan it around the room and under the desk and under the computers, and the proctor makes sure that there's no documents lying around. And then while you're taking the test, the camera has to be put in such an angle that you can't put anything on your desktop. He can see you completely. You're not allowed to leave your chair. And then off and on for the 3 hours or however long it is, it's a live feed. So whether he or she is or isn't looking at you the whole time, they have the right to.
Are they watching your screen at the same time like your remote?
That I don't know. I would believe so because we have to install special software for it. So that would make sense. Yeah, but I think, like, if you were to do it, I think most of you guys would be fine with it. There would be, I mean, some parts would push you, other parts wouldn't.
I
Just,
don't have working knowledge.
You will after next week.
Yeah.
No, after a couple of weeks, we'll do our lab.
Absolutely, but I
yeah, and that would be, I work in Linux, but it's been a while since I have, so I have to kind of touch up and refresh on that. And even then, I like OpenSUSE, Ubuntu. I have my flavors that I like. Kali, of course, you'll use for security thing, and that's what it's known for. But overall, you guys, I think, would do fine. Jess would even do good in some of it. Some of it would push. But foundationally, she's probably heard of almost everything we've already talked about. It just goes into more depth on the specifics for penetration testing and footprints and those things.
who runs those classes? That's what they do.
We do.
Well, yeah. Mike.
Yeah.
Jason and I.
All right.
And there's another contractor that if we're both busy,
Yeah.
we'll bring him in. He works out at CWI.
Like, literally a day behind.
I think so.
That's who.
Power?
Blind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's who Joe's running.
Yes, that's who Joe did.
You didn't leave.
Yeah, he came in. Jason was out of town, so he came in and did our CISSP for a week.
Yeah, he's very good. I like him.
Yeah. Thank you. Have a great night, guys.
See you tomorrow.
You bet. See you, Jess. I don't particularly like the CEH courseware because it leads more to a lot of